Well, thank you for having me here. Coming from Europe, this is actually quite the unusual place for me to present our work. So I would like to share with you some viewpoints on our general take on what has happened to Made in China 2025 and the implementation since it's been rolled out, as well as a special role that we see for Germany in this, in the implementation actually, and as well as how the mood in China, in Germany, in Europe has changed in regards to this industrial policy. So first I'd like to just remind ourselves, or we need to remind ourselves that even though Made in China 2025 has been the poster child of China's industrial policy, it is only one element of a very sophisticated state-led industrial policy in an effort for China to close a technological gap. And it goes way beyond the 10 industries that are part of Made in China 2025. There were other plans such as Internet Plus, which was, they'd like to present itself as this was more of a bottom-up approach, so coming from the private sector, the IT sector, but also as the IT sector in particular has become of more of a strategic national core interest. Also in this area, we have seen more of an alignment between the private and the state sector. So, and this is particularly in the case of IT companies, which have a crucial role in also building up a surveillance state, for example. So what we did see as the trade war has been, or the rhetoric in the trade war has become more aggressive, China's effort to tone down usage of vocabulary. So we've seen that they don't no longer like to use the term Made in China 2025. They've taken words out, sensitive words out of their reports, such as self-sufficiency rates, in an effort to appear less threatening to the outside world. But I would argue that their motivation and their objective to become a technology leader by 2049 is unchanged. And we are expecting a revised version of Made in China 2025, maybe January, February, in an effort to again appear less threatening. But they might want to appear less opening in some sectors. But again, I'm very skeptical that how meaningful these changes really are. I think one indicator of this is when we look at what was said during the Central Economic Work Conference, which was held end of December. They didn't use the word Made in China 2025, but really the content of their objectives to become a world-class manufacturing and a technology leader were again in there. So I think there's really nothing that changed. And what we have been looking at on the implementation side, we can also see the rollout is really in full swing. We see a number of pilot projects that were coming out related to to Made in China, as well as demonstration zones, as they're called. So this the state led effort to really roll out and facilitate the implementation is in full force. We've seen adjustments to the roadmap, and within the roadmap, for example, our market shares for certain segments in the industry. We've seen revisions. These can be very detailed. In some cases, we've seen in areas where China is quite confident, we've seen increases up to 100%. So that means 100% market share for Chinese companies in the Chinese market, leaving very little room for foreign companies, obviously. We've also seen an adjustment in priorities. So we see, in particular in areas where China sees also it's an opportunity to leapfrog. When you think about emerging industries such as autonomous driving or digitization, they see this as an opportunity where they don't necessarily have to catch up to the Western countries, but where they can put themselves in a leader position. Another area where we've seen or a strong emphasis on are in enabling technologies or core technologies, if you think about semiconductors, as well as new materials. These are elements that they see as crucial to become a technology leader, and they're doubling down on these efforts. And if you think about what has happened in the early stages of the trade war, when the US tried or threatened to cut ZTE off of the semiconductor supply, this really shocked them. And I think this was also clearly they felt here the need that they need to become less reliant on foreign technology in order to become also less vulnerable to any types of threats. Apart from the policy adjustments, we see some changes in the efficiency. So industrial policy, in most cases, also in China, has been associated with a lot of waste. We've had issues with overcapacities, as well as local and provincial governments, trying to compete amongst themselves and just wasting a lot of resources. So there have been efforts to improve the coordination here, but it also goes along the line to include a more venture capitalist model to have some sort of seed funding in areas where, well, they want to catch up and really also incorporate this entrepreneurial spirit that you have within China. So here, really, the effort is to become more efficient in building an innovative ecosystem in learning from, let's say, past experiences or trouble spots when they implemented their industrial policy. And this is also where there's a special role for Germany in building up this innovation system. Germany in generally has been seen as a good fit for China. It's strong in manufacturing, machinery in particular, and more importantly, it has presented itself as a very willing partner to engage with China. And apart from that, Germany also has a part of its innovation or its innovation system. It has a very important role for government or national research institutes that act as a transmission belt between academic research and the application in the industry. So this was also seen as a good fit out of the viewpoint from the Chinese. And this has led to a very deep cooperation, also encouraged by the German government and also facilitated by the German government, and has led to cooperation, as I mentioned, in these national research institutions in the area of basic research, for example. So this is, there's a number of institutes, around 5, that are very prominently also present in China in encouraging and facilitating innovation taking place in these areas of basic research. Another area where we see a heavily involvement is particularly in the area of smart manufacturing. And in this case, we have also a lot of involvement by German companies participating in this. I've been to smart manufacturing facilities in China built by the Chinese government where German companies are practicing and experiencing how to improve and implement digitalization of manufacturing. I find this quite remarkable, and I think this optimism mainly was based on utilizing the strength of the Chinese system in order to receive Chinese funding and to experiment in a very fast-moving market. And this has been seen as a win-win situation also out of the viewpoint of German companies. Now, what we did see though now in the past, over the past months or years, I would say, is a change in this attitude. And it started with a Chinese takeover of KUKA, a German robotics company, that really kicked off a more critical view of how we are engaging with China, primarily in the political sphere, while the business sphere was still trying to tone it down and trying to maintain a goodwill with China, because they've also profited from the cooperation they had with China. But also this is changing, and just last week, one of the major German industry associations has issued a paper where they have become more critical of how China has changed as an economic partner. They see them more as a competitor now, less willing to engage in a level playing field, and disappointing in a way in the way reforms have been implemented. And it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not the liberal market-based economy that most have hoped for. And in particular, if you look at and reflect on the close relationship and cooperation that Germany had with its Chinese partners, it's also becoming clear that they're engaging with a partner that's long-term interest is to replace you. So this makes it very difficult to really progress and continue on this cooperation with China. So this change in attitude is certainly taking place. And this, of course, does not necessarily mean that there's no way to engage and no longer cooperate with China. That probably also would be the wrong way. But I think we need to become more clear on what type of partner we're engaging with, and become less naive on how we engage. And that means to protect also our core interests and maintain a cooperation where there is a win-win situation. And with this, I would like to close and just put on or leave as one of the core messages here that we need to really rethink how we engage with China as a partner without having a complete disengagement. Thank you.
Come on over.
I will join you.
So Max, thanks for that comprehensive introduction to Made in China 2025. We're going to have a conversation for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. So please be thinking about what you'd like to ask. I'd like to start with a couple of things that someone in the Made in China 2025 universe has said recently, and this is Huawei founder and CEO Ren Zhengfei. So he told a group of reporters this week, "I will never do anything to harm any country in the world." But he told the Chinese news agency Xinhua last year, "We will always have the wolf culture. Catching prey may be difficult, but the wolf is unrelenting." Can both be true at the same time?
They cannot, but it's clearly they're playing to different audiences. And I mean, Huawei has been one of the cases very prominently engaged, and there's, in particular in Europe, there's a lot of, or also particularly in Germany, there's a lot of discussion on whether to use them as a 5G provider. If you arrive at the Berlin airport, there is advertisement by Huawei all over the place. On the other hand, you have a recent arrest last week also of the Huawei chief or head of sales in Poland. You have a discussion in the Czech Republic, and this is more the wolf side.
Okay, and in terms of, I mean, do you see a plausible future where China's Made in China 2025 policy can be net positive for others in the world? That, you know, the innovations and research and development, scientific breakthroughs that it adds are, you know, benefit everyone the way that innovations in the US and Europe have over time, even though there's been competition?
I think there would be a very optimistic outcome. I mean, let's hope for that. And I think we also need to be clear that there is a lot to gain also to engage with China in these areas. I mean, if you think about innovation that's taking place in China, if you go to Shenzhen, it would be of great benefit if also Western countries participate in this. But we're also at a stage where China is becoming more of a strategic rival, and we're having a competing economic system, which is making it very tricky to further cooperate and to really engage. And in this case, it also depends on how China reacts and how they are willing to adapt to also some demands coming from Western countries.
Mm. So I wanted to pick up on something you said in your presentation about how German companies and the German government are sort of rethinking how they should be viewing Made in China 2025 and investments in China and cooperation with China. How much have you seen that play out in terms of specific decisions made by companies? Like, we're not going to make these decisions anymore in China. We're not going to make these investments anymore in China. We're going to go elsewhere, or we're going to limit what kind of R&D we do in China, similar things.
I think we're at the very initial stages of this, and there's also very conflicting signs. If you think about BASF, a major German chemical company, just announced a 10 billion investment in China. So that's massive. You have BMW taking parts from its joint venture partner and also investing more in electric vehicles. You have Volkswagen announcing that China is the key market in this area. So from the big companies, at least from their headquarters, this is not so much happening. If I talk to people who are on the ground, and maybe not in the most senior level position, they are getting increasingly concerned. And I have, from a number of industries, or managers reaching out to me and concerned about how their CEOs are reacting and engaging with China, because they work with China on a day-to-day business. They see how things are changing, and it's no longer the same China that we had 10 years ago. And that also means that if you think about joint venture agreements, or also even in the area of research cooperation, the tone has changed, and they've become also smarter and better at extracting knowledge.
So all this is happening while China is beginning to face, as you mentioned, considerable economic headwinds. I mean, the official growth rate right now is 6.5%, down from earlier, or even a little lower, down from earlier in 2018. But a Randa, People's University economist thought, he actually came out publicly saying, actually, I think it's below 2%. Given that some of the headwinds that China may be facing, and given that Chinese President Xi Jinping is kind of doubling down on strengthening the state sector as opposed to the private sector, and that most of China's growth and innovation over the last 20 or 30 years have come from the private sector, how do you think this may play out going forward in the next 6 years that are part of the Made in China 2025 plan?
Well, that's certainly a challenge. I would be very cautious on seeing or foreseeing an imminent crash in China. Of course, it's also something we've been talking about for the past 20 years, which hasn't materialized. I also don't see this as imminent. But we have also seen, I mentioned this in my presentation, efforts to become more efficient in rolling out innovation, in industrial policy and innovation. And this will go hand in hand with their efforts in also getting China on a more sustainable development path. So I think this might even facilitate this or more market elements to work within the system. But I think here's one of the key misunderstandings, at least in my view, that have resulted going back to 2013 in the third plenum when they announced strengthening of market mechanisms. This does not mean that the state is retreating. It's just, in my view, means that the market mechanisms are supposed to be integrated into the system in order to optimize it and optimize the state-led capitalist model that China has been developing quite successfully over the past decades.
And do you think that's happening?
And I think that's definitely happening. And I think one of the crucial questions that we will have, you've mentioned how China has already developed, how the private sector has been innovative, if they will be able to maintain this innovation, or are they going to be suffocated by this? In particular, this is the case in tech, in the IT sector, which is becoming an integral factor or part of the national strategic goals that go into the military as well as building up a surveillance state. So that is yet to be seen, and that will be, I think, a very crucial element if they will able to maintain this actually very remarkable entrepreneurial spirit that exists in China.
Right. So I mean, certainly a strength for China is that the government puts a lot of money into research and development, a lot of incentives for private firms to be scrappy and innovative and to experiment. But if increasingly the state sector is incentivized more, or the private sector doesn't kind of have the room to run, just building on what you just said, what's a plausible future you could see where Made in China 2025 doesn't go the way the Chinese government expects it to go?
Well, firstly, I would also like to, before I answer the question, is that what has happened under Xi Jinping is it's no longer really possible to distinguish between the government and the party. And what we have seen more a strengthening of party activities in companies, also private companies, including foreign companies. So, and this has also changed the environment and the business environment in China dramatically. Now, when it comes to how Made in China 2025 will roll out, I mean, it's not a given that it will be a success. And I think one remarkable difference compared to the past decades is that before, when China did industrial policy, its main impact was domestic. And that's why also foreign companies accepted the trade-off for, let's say, technology transfer in order to have market access in China. But now what China does in China is starting to have a global impact, much more than trade deficit in buying consumer goods. It has impact on how global innovation takes place. I mean, just think about e-vehicles. If it wasn't for China, it would still be a niche market. I mean, it's still a niche market, but the dynamics in this industry would be quite differently.
Renewable energy, the same thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but so the plausible future where things don't go the way China expects, like what do you think could go wrong over these next few years, given what we see happening already, including what you just said about the change in the business environment and how that affects innovation? I would,
one major element obviously would be the economic stability, which is the foundation of any of this taking place. And but that aside, it also depends on how China will react to the outside world. and if they were willing to make some concessions in order to present itself as a partner one could work with, or if they play or further deteriorate any type of trust, and we really see this disengagement and have a kind of a Cold War style economic or clash of economic systems, and that would be then very interesting to see how that evolves. I mean, China is big enough and in a way different position than the Soviet Union, for example, but I think this is nothing we want to hope for.
Yeah, so that's like how China in the world. In terms of at home, there's always this question of, you know, what kind of environment, what kind of factors, you know, best encourage and enable innovation at the highest level as well as at lower levels. And this is, you know, achieving that kind of innovation has been a goal of the Chinese government for more than 20 years. China's good at all kinds of innovations, but maybe getting from 0 to 1, not as good. And I'm wondering how do you feel about Xi Jinping's current policies in terms of limiting free speech, limiting conversation, limiting the flow of ideas, how that affects the environment for innovation? Well,
that may constrain innovation in China, but on the other side, the dynamics and also this pride within China are also very strong drivers for this. And I think one very important element we need to consider is that China sees itself on a path to reclaim the top spot. It's not that it was more that they would say that the Western countries, you were there 200 years or whatnot, but we're now on our path to go back to this top position. And I think this sense of national pride in itself might be a very strong driver to be innovative and to pursue these goals.
And certainly there's been a strong reaction from the US as well as from Germany to China pursuing these goals so deliberately and methodically and aggressively. Do you think that could spur more innovation, like more investment in R&D, you know, kind of light a fire beneath the feet of those in the West who perhaps have gotten a little more complacent?
I would very much hope for that. And I think this is also something we need to keep in mind when we are dealing with China. And we need to also understand there are some very legitimate goals that China has for itself. I mean, it still needs to break through the middle income trap, and we tend to forget after 40 years of opening and reform and this tremendous success that has materialized in China, it still has a long way to go to catch up. And likewise, we need to, like you said, also look back at our strengths and invest more in these areas and build on these strengths. But at the core of this is also to defend the market-based liberal economic system, which is the foundation of that. So I think these type of things, or these two things, go hand in hand.
Yeah. So whenever thinking about the long-term future, there are always wild cards, right? There are things that maybe you're not thinking about as much at this moment that maybe you could, because, you know, in hindsight, you know, 50 years from now, we may look back and say, why didn't we see what India was capable of, for instance? So when you, again, back to the plausible future question, when you think of what China has in mind for what's going to be true in the world in 2049, that China is going to be the global leader, the leader in technology and innovation, and all the things that it's working on right now and Made in China 2025. What else do you think might happen in terms of other rising powers and other rising capabilities elsewhere in the world?
Well, I'm not an expert on India per se, but or not at all. But obviously, that is also another game changer that will come in particular related to if you look at demographics. So Chinese population is about to decline. They're aging. These are all factors that might also work against the dynamics that we currently see, and these are also issues that the Chinese government is clearly very concerned about. The consequences resulting from that will become even more eminent over the next few years.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to questions, and there are quite a few. Let me start with you.
Hi, good morning. My name's George Koo. I've been participating in the China economic reform since 1978. In fact, I have a copy of the People's Daily Extra Edition announcing the normalization of U.S.-China relations. That was one of the most exciting days. I happened to be in Beijing at the time. So I've seen all this, and I think it's very interesting that early on in the history of China with the West, in a sense of reform, the general attitude was, oh, the Chinese are backward, they don't know anything, we need to help them. It's okay if we share the technology because they'll never catch up to us. Now it's just the opposite. Now they're the juggernaut. And when they have Made in China 2025, it's really an aspirational document from their point of view. But from the West, it seems to be a threat. So from what you've just said and what others have said and what's been said in the US, China's goal becomes a zero-sum game. And I don't think China sees it that way. And certainly in the way China deals with the third world countries, it's not a zero-sum game. Even though in the public media in the US, we tend to position it as they're out to do predatory financing, they're going to do this and do that. So there's an element of hostility that seems to cover all of what we're talking about. Would you comment on that?
Sure. I would say this hostility is also quite recent. There was and you also mentioned that, the West was also accommodating to China and welcoming it. And also China benefited greatly from that. But I think China, in a way, also got struggled to read also changing attitudes in the West. And now we're in a period where, China is rolling out documents that come over as very aggressive, and you have a lack of transparency when it comes to China's more growing global role. And this is not, we're not helping. And I think just as we need to understand the new modern China particularly and how it's developing, and it's provided also some room to reach its legitimate roles. I mean, as I said, the middle income trap, China didn't break through that yet. It's still a long way. But what does China expect? That the West sits back and just watches as its own industrial foundation evaporates? That's also not going to happen. So, we need to adjust to each other in order to make this relationship work.
I'd just like to add to that. So I was a correspondent in China for 15 years, but I also reported in pretty much every country in Asia and many in Africa, often looking at how people felt about China's investment. And it's not just Western journalists writing negative things about how people feel about Chinese investment. There's a lot of negative feeling about how China's investing. Not entirely, it's very mixed. But I was in Malaysia for the elections in May, and people were making a point of saying, coming up and saying, we don't want to be a colony again. We've been here before, and we don't like what we see in Sri Lanka with China taking over the port of Hambantota for 99 years, plus 15,000 acres around it. We see that as a sign of something we want to avoid. And so they re-elected Mahathir Mohamad and changed their policies. So, I think also China's government needs to learn its way into, if it's going to be the major global power, or even, an even more powerful global power than it is already, to be more conscious of how its actions in different countries are being perceived by the people in those countries. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm Z.
Sorry, I'll come to you next.
So you spoke of Germany and Europe as if they're synonymous. And obviously, we know it's not a unified bloc. Can you speak about the division that exists within Europe with regards to China and different approaches that different countries are taking?
Sure. There's big division in Europe, and for the most, also Europe is busy with itself and trying to maintain the bloc. And this also goes in how to deal with China. And China has been very good at driving a wedge also in how Europe or how individual countries deal with China. And China would love to or prefers to deal with individual countries rather than a bloc. And there is divisions. If you look at the interest of, let's say, Portugal or Greece vis-a-vis China, or when it comes to Germany or France or the Scandinavian countries that have the technology actually that China is interested in. But also here, and so I agree with you. You cannot talk of one European voice on this. But I think there's also efforts to facilitate that. In particular, there was an announcement, I think just a few days ago, for 2020, when Germany will have the EU presidency, rotating presidency, that they will try to speak with a stronger voice, a stronger European voice in dealing with China. And I think that is extremely necessary in also finding an adequate response.
There's a microphone back there, and then we'll come to you next. Yeah, please.
Okay. So I'm Howard Chow. So I'm not a big fan of 2025, China 2025 policy, but given the fact that we know there are a lot of statistics about how poor the return on equity of SOEs is. I mean, this is a statist kind of policy, right? How poorly SOEs generally are managed. Given the fact that domestically in China, the reaction to the return to more statist policy directions has been pretty negative, and there's a lot of fear in China. There's a lot of negativity in China about where the government is headed. Couldn't you make an argument that in an alternative universe where China executed the reforms that we actually wanted them to execute, and the economy blossomed, and they grew at a much higher rate than they are currently growing at because they executed reforms, that they would be in 2025 or 2040 a much stronger strategic competitor than they otherwise would be under the current course?
Well, I think I would still, in this parallel or this alternative universe, I would prefer that. And I think there is no reason why we should not be able to compete with each other on a level playing field. I mean, European companies compete with American companies, with Japanese companies. But there was an arrangement that worked for all. And you mentioned the element of the bad return on equity, which is a problem. You have a system that pursues very long-term strategic interests, and the return on capital is not that important in the short term. So this is not compatible with our systems, and this will make it difficult to, if you're dealing with a government or a country of the size of the Chinese economy, also on a global scale, where, let's say, in emerging industries you have this massive buildup of overcapacity still, and you cut off innovation that potentially could also take place in the US or Europe in order to then have companies compete amongst each other. And this is, I think, exactly the point where we'd have to rearrange our economic relationship with China to work towards this goal, to have China that is strong in certain areas and where we compete, and also accept areas where China is leading in science. It's not about suppressing what's happening in China. I mean, that would be absurd, I think.
Good.
Hi, my name is Alice. I work here at the Hoover Institution. I have two interconnected questions about EU-China relationship. First is what you mentioned about Chinese investment. So EU FDI screening should be approved by Parliament in March, and the text seems already quite watered down. Are you, the first question, concerned that it's ultimately going to be a toothless document because it's up to the discretion of each member state to decide whether or not to approve a transaction? And secondly, the 5G question, it baffles me that you have countries in the Five Eyes, like Australia and New Zealand, are outrightly banning Huawei from 5G, and yet French, German statements haven't shown any kind of restriction. In fact, they want to continue working with Huawei. So could you explain why that's the case? It's been quite intriguing to me. Thank you.
Sure. So for your first question regarding the investment screening in Europe, there has been some movement, but I think in generally there was also a lot of resistance by countries that would like to maintain an open investment regime. And I would agree with you, it has been watered down, but in my view, it's nice per se, but it's more of a gesture. And I think regardless of what's really in how much teeth are really in the document, it still reflects a change in attitude on how Chinese investment, in particular in high-tech investment, is seen. On the other hand, even if it was a very effective tool, the underlying target of Chinese or their motivation to acquire or access foreign technology is unchanged. So I kind of see it as tax evasion. If the tax bureau can tighten regulation, but your incentive to pay as little tax is still there, and you're just going to try to navigate the system. So I think the most important point here is the signaling effect. Regarding Huawei, I mentioned early on in the beginning that also Huawei is very active in Germany and trying to lobby and present itself as a partner one could work with in implementing 5G. They've opened up an innovation center in Germany and also trying to facilitate this view on them. And the German, and I can't speak for the German government, nor do I want to, but their response to this has been, well, where is the evidence? And I often get asked the situation about Huawei in Europe, and yes, it's not a very transparent company, and there are some concerns regarding employing their technology, but is there really, is there really any hard evidence that one can work on that goes beyond suspicion? And you would also understand, I think it would be necessary to understand the context from Europe. Europe was not particularly thrilled about US spy activity taking place in their sector. So you need to see both sides in this.
Yeah, you had your hand up earlier. Right here in the front.
My name is Yabo. Thank you so much, Max, for traveling all the way, and Mary Kay for traveling across the pond. I just have one question, Max. You mentioned that China needs to make a compromise in the Make in China 2025 program. Otherwise, the West must be on the alert or cautious or try to resist working with China, as it did in the past. Can you give me maybe top 2 or 3 compromises China can make that would satisfy the West?
Well, okay, that's a very demanding question. Trying to solve it all. I think they need to be more transparent in their engagement with vis-a-vis also their global activity. They need to be more bold in opening up. I mean, we've talked about this a lot, and I think China also does an excellent job on presenting itself as opening up and reforming, and nonetheless, in my view, it's still extremely selective, and this needs to change. They also need to take on some risk and take on way bolder forms of opening up. And one issue I have, and this I think is really the most tricky part, so on the one hand, even though if China is opening, in some areas. On the other hand, you have expanding party activities in companies. So how does that work? And this is becoming really difficult to integrate the role of the party in what China is doing in its opening process. So I think this is really one of the stumbling blocks. But in an effort to try to answer your question, I would have 2 remarks. The first one was, as I said before, be more bold in opening up. And also be more confident about what opening up can do for its own economy without seeing it as a potential threat. And the other area is also to engage in a stronger win-win situation in areas where China is already very advanced. And have foreign companies and businesses participate in the strength that China has without going into also a very defensive mode and trying to seal this off from Western partners.
I want to sneak in a quick question related to openness of a different sort. So you spent many years living in China and in Shenzhen in particular, and then in Beijing. And I was there I was living in China and covering it until 2013. Right around that time, I was talking to someone who works in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, who was saying, we have this issue inside the Chinese Academy of Sciences where it's not just that, we're competing with people outside of China. We're competing with each other. We're competing for funding, so we don't really share our research as much with each other as a lot of scientists in other countries do. And this is something we really need to learn how to do because it's holding us back. What did you find on that count when you were in China? What are you finding now? And how much is that beginning to change? How much, if at all, is that culture changing?
I would say it's changing to the worse.
Oh.
Yeah, because it again comes to, well, a tendency for, and I mean, this is it's a very dynamic scenario at the moment, situation at the moment, but it can also lead to a very, or I see a more hostile environment taking place, where one tries to find or pursue targets that are, or that the government has set or the party has set, and then it might lead to, I mean, for the one instance, we have ethical issues taking place, and then, but also and other researchers ratting out each other. And I think this is not compatible with a very open system, and it goes beyond what happens within China. I mean, look at we're at a university that is inviting smart brains from all over the world and to exchange ideas. Well, if you're in China conducting research, well, you're very limited on even what you can access. And I think this again shows how in these areas how defensive China is about this, and might in the long run, also in the medium run, cause more harm to its own development.
Is there an example, or more than one example, of a Chinese company that's doing this well? Like I know BGI has a lot of, formerly the Beijing Genomics Institute, has a lot of international interactions, cooperation. I mean, are you finding that some companies, at least in Shenzhen in particular, which tends to be a little more open, are better at sharing ideas and sharing research?
I don't have knowledge on that.
No.
Or I could name you a particular company that is doing that well.
Okay. Other questions? So George.
I want to finish. I want to address your
Okay.
comment about Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
It's the Sri Lanka example is an excellent example of how Western media's point of view is not a complete point of view. For example, the Sri Lanka government wanted those projects, and they went to World Bank, they went to Asia Development Bank, they went to Japan. None of them wanted to finance it. So China was their last resort to finance that project. And when China did finance it, and it didn't pay off, the reason they took it over was to relieve the debt burden that Sri Lanka would otherwise have to pay. You know, by taking possession, that takes that debt off their load. So it's not exactly China's predatory financing. It just ended up that way. Now, I have a website I want to recommend. Deborah Bodigan, I don't know if you heard of her. She teaches at Johns Hopkins.
Dragon's Gift.
Huh?
She wrote a book called The Dragon's Gift about Chinese investment in Africa.
Right, and she maintains a website on all the projects going on in Africa by China. Mm-hmm. And her reporters are down the road, objective, not opinions, and many of them tend to refute what's being said by the West, including the book by Howard French, for example. So my whole point is that there's always a different point of view besides the one that we hear from the Western media.
Right. And my point was just, this isn't just the Western media. This is what Asians, Southeast Asians, are saying about that. So other questions? Jim, way over here.
I would like to address Sri Lanka. Just because of what I've heard from Chinese friends involved in the development world, that basically it was incompetence. Xi Jinping announced Belt and Road in 2015 in 2 places, and there was nothing behind it. Then all the SOEs, NDRC, everybody had KPIs that they had to do Belt and Road projects. So these guys went out and they looked for anything they could. Sri Lanka, they ended up with a very corrupt dictator who wanted stuff in his hometown. Those projects didn't make sense, but you're fulfilling your KPI back in Beijing. And so a lot of these projects were not China trying to put these countries in debt diplomacy. They were just doing what they do naturally at home. And that ended up a mess globally, so it's something to clean up. So I don't think China's trying to trap the world. China just brought local practices out and trying to fulfill what the party wanted with no controls, because none of those projects make any sense in Sri Lanka. That port where it's positioned, the airport that has no airplanes, come on.
Do you want to comment on that at all?
I think Sri Lanka plenty has been said.
Okay. Other questions? We have time for maybe a couple more. If anyone still has a question. Going once. Okay, back here.
Good morning, Michelle Leidecker. I think I'd be remiss in not bringing up the issue of foreigners traveling to China, given the issue with Huawei, and then in the last 24 hours, an announcement about the Chinese government announcing an execution of arguably for a common crime. So I just wondered if it's how that impact might be going on now about people being concerned about traveling to China as foreign business owners or operators or managers. I mean, obviously there's just idiosyncratic examples, but there's an atmosphere. I've been asking people, they're a little bit more hesitant to travel to China, and I think I'm excited about China's future, and I'm just thinking maybe China's going to be a leader in how countries can be open on the one hand and yet get so involved in population control through ID cards that'll have meritorious marking systems, all the data that's being accumulated through surveillance cameras, especially in Xinjiang and everywhere. So I think we're living in interesting times, and I'm hoping that China will be a great example to the world of how to be open while at the same time pursuing their own domestic goals. But I'm one influencing the other in a way that I hope will keep things open. But I guess my question would be whether people are hesitating to travel now to China given the arrests.
And if you don't know the specific answer to how much people are hesitating, should they be?
Well, I don't have any numbers on that, and it really depends on what you're doing and what type of activity. If you're going for tourism, go ahead. There's no reason not to go. But the environment in China has definitely been changing. I lived in China up until 2016, and one reason for me to leave the country was because I felt increasingly uncomfortable. And it was becoming clear that this is not an area or a country where you're able to speak your mind and have a critical discourse on issues. I'm an economist. This was, when I started working on China, this was a very active debate also in China, in how China's economy is progressing, and the sensitive issues, human rights, Tibet, those were off limits, no question. But the area of topics that are off limits has expanded. And it's becoming much more repressive and, in my view, also uncomfortable, where in my line of work, when I go to China, I'm very concerned and vigilant about what I'm doing or who I'm engaging with. I have very strange people reaching out to me out of the blue, and I'm not as open as I was when I first went to China, unfortunately.
So last question, we have 1 minute. So when German business people come to you, either formally or informally, and say, hey, I'm thinking of investing in China, do you say, yeah, go for it, but just be a little careful for these reasons, or hold off for now, or what do you tell them?
Well, they don't necessarily come to me for investment advice.
Over a beer.
But I mean, most German companies are already heavily invested in China. And in my previous job, I was working for the German Chamber, and at that time period, between 2010 onwards, it was also a time when German companies more heavily invested in R&D activities in China. And in parts, they were also part of a very global setup in order to tap into strength within China. But when you think about legislation related to the cybersecurity in China, which is also creating an environment where it becomes more difficult for foreign companies to engage in these type of activities. So my advice will then be to be more cautious and also to see China as how it has been changing. And a lot of companies that also have been in China active for a long time, they say, oh, we've seen all this. And party cells in the company, oh, well, we had the trade union before, same. I don't agree. I think we're in a time where the environment has dramatically changed. And if you deal with the situation with the same mindset that you had a decade ago, you're in for trouble.
And on that note, thank you, Max. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Max and Mary Kay.